Hi everyone, I'm drkerryann Williams, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. On today's show, I'm going to be speaking with Gabby Palmer. She's a nationally certified school psychologist. She's also the coordinator of mentorship and workforce development programs at William James College. And on today's show, she's going to be talking to us about how to help parents navigate the school system. So if that's of interest to you, then keep listening. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm drkerryann Williams, and this is a talk show that's about all things related to mental wellness in the Black community. So throughout the show, if you have any questions or comments, you can give us a call at 617-238-7111. That's 617-238-7111. We're also streaming live on Facebook, so you can check out the Facebook live stream on the Facebook page, heat981fm.com. So that's Facebook page, heat981fm.com. So check us out on Facebook Live, call in if you have questions, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. So today in the studio, I have Gabrielle Palmer, Gabby. She is the coordinator of mentorship and workforce development programs at William James College. She is also a teaching faculty there, and she's a nationally certified and licensed school psychologist. And I wanted to bring her on the show today because we have so many parents that are trying to navigate the school system. And I wanted to bring someone who is an insider, who understands how the schools think, but also understands children of color in schools and kind of what happens there. So, Gabby, welcome to the show. Welcome. And tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you even decided to become a school psychologist.
Hi, everyone. So lovely to be here. Thank you so much, drkerryann. Wonderful intro. I've done a couple different things so far. And to answer your last question first, So being a school psychologist was definitely something that was not on my radar growing up. I didn't really know what it was. I said this all the time, but the first time I even met a school psychologist was my interview day at William James College. So I didn't even know what one would look like until I got there. And when I applied at William James, I initially applied in the clinical psych program, but I just could not let myself be okay with being in school for like 6 more years. After undergrad, it was too much and too soon. And I happened to see the school psychology program, and it hit everything I wanted. I didn't want to be a teacher at the time, and at least in the K-12 system. And I felt I want to work with kids. I don't want to be a teacher, but I really want to be there for them. And that's exactly what I ended up doing. And now I've transitioned into so many different things where I'm still working with the same communities and making an impact, and that makes me happy.
And so right now in your role at William James College, are you currently still doing school-based psychology, or are you pretty much all administrative, or how does that kind of work out right now?
Great question. So I don't do too many school psych stuff in itself, but I do take all of the skills I've learned and used and taking it in my teaching with the undergraduate at William James, plus the mentorship programs that I lead. All of those skills are like the interpersonal skills, working with folks, and really just meeting them where they're at. I learned working in school psych. So I'm able to take those skills together, but it's really nice because I went to grad school at William James, and that's where I learned everything school psychology. And now I'm there in a completely different way. So it's so fun to see the same folks I worked with and grew with and who mentored me now be my colleagues. It's so odd, but it's definitely it's so comfortable, and there's so much room to grow, and I love it.
So how many years did you kind of work in schools?
Oh, that's a long list of years. Fun fact, so my mom actually works at the Board of Ed in New York as a secretary, and she's been doing that since as long as I can remember. So every single summer vacation I had, I spent weeks with her at her different types of schools in different districts in New York City. Plus, I, on top of that, would work in schools just because I love the dynamic and the communities. And then I transitioned to college, and I worked in this wonderful organization as a student organization, Student Bridges. And in that organization, I actually worked in schools in Holyoke and Springfield as a tutor mentor. And then that continued down to grad school, William James. And I did my internships, my practicums with different schools, and then I was a school psychologist.
Oh, wow. So, I mean, I'm glad to have you on. I don't know if I've had a school psychologist on the show before, actually. So I'm going to have a lot of questions for you. But, you know, one of the things that I've always kind of thought about is, you know, I'm always on the side of being kind of the like psychiatrist that's on the outside of the school. I mean, I work in a therapeutic school that's very different from kind of public schools. I work in a special like residential school that's really not necessarily kind of always funded by the school system. It has
not the typical.
Yeah, it has kind of a different setup for how things go. And so I've always been curious about the other side. How do schools see children that have special education needs? How do they see children that have mental health conditions? Because we know about this thing called the school to prison pipeline, where, you know, for listeners that may or may not have heard of it, it's kind of this thought that sometimes schools become a place where kids become predisposed to having more contact with the legal system and can end up having a pathway that leads them actually into incarceration. And I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the school to prison pipeline. You probably could explain it a lot better than I can. And you've had like a poster presentation on this before at a national conference. So tell us a little bit more about the school to prison pipeline and kind of what it is.
So you make a really good point about kind of the inside and the outside, right? And I feel like even with the pipeline, that very same thought applies. We think of a lot of our schools and our students of color, we think about the communities that they're in, especially public schools, right? We think about funding in communities and how depending on how communities and the organizations or buildings that are there are paid by taxpayers. And that's all based on the community you're in. So in low-income communities, the taxes that are paid aren't as quote unquote high as let's say higher income areas, and then that gets reflected in their school system, especially with the allocation of funds. Most times, and it's been a topic of debate for a very long time, is how much funds schools get. I mean, this is one other topic on defunding the police and things like that, and reallocating that money to our education system. But going back to the low-income neighborhoods and those schools, those are the schools that we typically see the pipeline existing a bit more. We think about, you know, how many times I just said I've never seen a school psychologist before in school, but best believe I've seen student resource officers, right? I've seen folks carry batons and stun guns and individuals.
And for those that don't know, school resource officers are police officers that are present in schools.
Yes. And I've seen schools do a really good job about having student resource officer and being, and those individuals definitely, quote unquote, not being the bad apple. Who, you know, very much care for the kids and are there for them and really want them to do well. But then on the other hand, we have the rotten apples, right? And those are the schools where the officers definitely take a much heavier stand on the discipline system. And we have strike systems as well. And the way these students receive strikes, both in the classroom, out the classroom, are just behaviors that aren't addressed in any way, mental health and problem solving and any of those things. But first it's just seen as let's discipline them. And the way that they get disciplined is by engaging in activities that just make it even harder for them to be included. And then being targeted, and once your name's out there, then that's it forever. Especially in those communities where it can be difficult to get out of them. So all in all, that pipeline itself exists, and it brings up this concept of equity and equality. And for those who don't know, there's a great visual out there of just imagine 4 folks watching a baseball game. There's a gate in front of them, right? And we're going to use height as an example. But this really can be from race to sex to gender, sexuality, ability versus disability, everything. We think about, let's say, who the gate is 5'4", and it's a person who's like 5'6", is able to see right over the gate, watches basketball game, and it's great. And then you have a smaller person, let's say who's like a foot tall, a toddler, whomever, and they need, let's say, 4 boxes to stand on to be able to see over the gate. Giving the first person no boxes and the second person 4 boxes to see, that's equity playing out, right? Giving what someone needs to succeed. And that's what special education is all about too. And that's, as a school psychologist, my role was the gatekeeper special education, to really give the students who weren't able to access their curriculum the ability to access that, whether that be through accommodations or recommendations or just complete changing of the curriculum. And those are done through IEPs and 504s, which I can definitely get into in a minute. But as a gatekeeper, I would help students who couldn't access their curriculum and give them resources. Some things like, and all of this is of course needed on legal documentation because you're changing things, modifying or accommodating them. Like if you need extended time to finish a test, right? Something that we see even in our adult life. Oh, give me a minute and we just finish something up real quick, or give me an extra hour, I'll give it to you in a minute, especially at work, right? When you want to extend deadlines, that same thing in schools, giving the extension of deadlines to our students. And that right there is an accommodation. And it seems so small, especially in your adult life, where you're like, yeah, I ask for deadline extensions all the time. But for K through 12, and to do that or to give that and on a consistent basis requires a plan. And that plan can look like an individualized education plan or an accommodation 504 plan.
So now, as a psychologist, as also one of the few Black psychologists out there, I mean, do you have anything to say about how, I guess, the role of like representation? Because I think about, psychologists seem to, they have an important voice in what schools do with children who need accommodations. And I imagine then that that's not free from bias, from unconscious bias as well, in terms of how a psychologist might see a student of color and their needs, how they interpret their behavior. Despite the fact that they may be doing certain kind of questionnaires and tests, they may still have unconscious bias about how they see students. What do you see as kind of the importance of representation? How meaningful was it that you were a psychologist of color, that you were a Black psychologist in a school?
Right, and to add to that, on top of all of that, being a Black woman, right, and then a school psychologist at that, and on top of all of that, also being young, right? There's a whole other identity.
All these intersections.
All of these identities, and I'm 25, and while I was practicing, I was, 23? And being in a high school, let me tell you, being in a high school and being 5'4", the height I am, around these high schoolers who I swear were like, you can't in 10th grade, you just can't. There are just so many things that are going on, and I'll just say the representation is a heavy weight. Going from being in a graduate school that's already a very small school, right? And at the time I was the only person of color, or Black, let's just say I was the only Black woman in, at the time, the staff and the entire department, staff, students, all in class.
So with teachers and everything.
And that's definitely changed now. But at the time, I have to tell you, it was a little jarring. And at William James, I was able to find a resource, the Black Mental Health Graduate Academy, ran and led by our beautiful and wonderful Dr. Natalie Court. And I felt I had a sense of community there, and I was able to really take that on and say, okay, I can do this. I have support. I'm not alone. But then going into schools is a whole different story. And it was also a very heavy weight, especially walking into a school where I'm the new person, right? And all of these students are like, oh, who are you? Who are you? You look like me. And I've been told, oh, you look like me. I'm like, yeah. Or, it's just not a very typical thing. Even guidance counselors or adjustment counselors, on top of that, being seen a little bit different than a guidance counselor. I can't tell you how many times. And I get it, but you're a guidance counselor. No, I'm a school psychologist. Oh, so you can help my kid, and you can do therapy, right? I'm like, well, yeah, but no. I test the students, and I see if they're eligible for special education. I of course can work with your student in counseling, in a counseling way. But overall, the representation, it was a heavy weight, and it still is. Black school psychologists make up 4%. 4%. That's of 2016, so that might have changed. But I don't think by much, if anything.
Probably not very much. I don't imagine there being a surge in that short period.
No, especially,
especially with the pandemic last year.
On top of that, yes. And that definitely had an effect on me, being at school. I would be sitting in my office, And I would be writing my report and grading and scoring some assessments, and a student would walk in. And more likely it was a student of color, just to be transparent. And I understood that, right? Something that I very much looked to when I was younger, and as I was growing and learning, was to quote, be who you needed when you were younger.
Yeah, be who you needed when you were younger.
Yeah,
okay.
And that really stuck with me, and has been definitely the middle of everything that I do. And a student walk in and just say, I'm having this issue, I'm having a boy problem. And I'm like, okay, I'm totally qualified. Yes. Not really. No. And we would talk, and then next thing you know, it went from a boy problem to a home problem to a family problem to just, I don't like living in my neighborhood, or my friends treat me differently, or they just don't understand. And I worked specifically in Norwell, and worked at a charter school there, and we worked with like 20 different towns and communities around that area, and that included towns like Randolph, but also went to Weymouth and Hingham, and just very different neighborhoods made up of cultural backgrounds.
Yeah.
And it was just, it's definitely different, because I'm sitting down like, I definitely have an assessment to go back to do at the end of the day, but what's more important right now? Right? If this student, if I tell a student, hey, I can't talk right now, I have things to do, what are they going to do after that? What are they going to think? And where are they going to go next when they need support?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So definitely prioritizing the support of the students above all. But it was still difficult, because I had to tell myself, like, they need me right now.
Yeah.
And even though that's a heavy weight to have, I'm the only one who can help them, or at least I can guide them somewhere. And it was definitely really hard to leave them, I will tell you that.
I mean, do you feel like there was kind of like an additional pressure, like, oh my gosh, you're the only like Black kind of psychologists around, like, like the students are kind of like starting to rely on you,
right?
Or feel
they had no idea what my role was. They just saw me as Miss Gabby, and that was pretty much it. I did explain to them what I do, just would not have gone the way I wanted it to, because it would have opened up a whole other like levy of, what do you mean IQ score? What do you mean? Like, can you test me? I'm like, I can, but I can't. And I think, honestly, I want to help them. And even though, like I said, as much a responsibility as it was something that I knew I wanted to do, right? That's the reason why I got in this field. I wanted to help students. I just didn't want to teach them.
Yeah, right.
And I was able to do exactly that. And I was able to really take some of that overrepresentation and underrepresentation of special education in my hands.
Yeah.
Like, at the school, I was at the forefront of deciding whether or not, and it was a team effort for sure, it wasn't an individual effort, to say, does this student qualify for special education? What can we give them? Right? I was able to educate parents of color who were not familiar with the system, who either were immigrants or just was in this community, and say, it's okay for your child, it's okay for your Black boy or Black girl to have an IEP. Yeah. That is not at all a weakness. That is not something to be shamed about. Yeah. It is, this is just what we need to give your child support. We need a legal document that you signed and said yes. And I get that it's scary to see that, there's a disability section, and, that can say things like ADHD or autism or an executive functioning disorder or reading disability or math disability. I get that's really scary to see. But at the same time, that's not a label that's going to follow them for the rest of their lives. An IEP stops at 12th grade. In Massachusetts, 21 years old, that's it. Like, and then they're off. Yeah. And that doesn't follow them. No one gets your records at the end and saying, yeah, you had disability in high school. No, that's not how it goes. And it was just great to be able to work with these parents and say, look, I know that it's scary. I know that this isn't what you wanted, and you know that your child, your baby, isn't doing what you want them to be doing and how you want them to be doing it, no matter how hard you've worked, right? That validation too, because a lot of our parents of color are working 10 times harder to give their children what they need to succeed. And there's so many boundaries that are there. So a lot of that is they feel like they failed, or they feel like their child is failing.
No.
And neither of that is true. Your child
Right.
is working 10 times as hard as a neurotypical child, just so they can show up and be there.
Mm-hmm.
And if your child can sit with me for 3 hours, I'm so sorry, but 3 hours, and I can go through multiple assessments with them to narrow down what the problem is, and I can write a report and say, look, here's where they're functioning, and here's where they're at. Here's how we can help, and here's how you can help.
Yeah.
And here's how we're gonna help for the next at least 3 years. Let me help you.
Yeah, and also this idea that denying that the problem is there or trying not to address it doesn't make it go away.
Right.
And I think there's sometimes a sense of like
They'll
be okay. Yeah, they'll grow
Yeah.
out of it. They'll be fine. Eventually, it won't be an issue anymore. But in the meanwhile, your child is in class struggling, and their peers are exceeding them.
Right, and they see that,
Yeah, and they see that
and
happening.
They feel that.
Yeah.
And then no one wants to feel embarrassed, right? You walking into your classroom and there's children running over your shoe, and you're like, everyone's like pointing at you, making fun of you. Like, that's so minimal. But then to say, hey, I can't finish this exam. Hey, I can't have more time. That's even harder. And then that stresses on the student. And then there's a way of like, oh, we'll just tutor them outside. But at the same time, do you know what they need?
Exactly.
Right? You can get a tutor. Absolutely. Tutors are amazing if it's a support that your child can benefit from.
Yeah.
But maybe your student doesn't need a tutor. They need someone to take away parts of their curriculum for them so they can access it, right? Or they need more time, or just less questions, right? If there's an exam that has like 10 questions on it and it's the same theme and same concept, give them 5. You don't need to give them 10.
Yeah.
You still accomplish the same thing, right? You can still see their skill. It's just that after question number 7, they can't do it anymore.
And I've seen, just on the kind of and you see this also in psychology, but I see it in psychiatry as well. Like, these students that they come in and they kind of wonder, like, well, what's wrong with me? Why isn't, they'll say in particular, like, why isn't my brain like working the way I want it to work? And when there isn't like an answer for them, like, well, here's what's going on. You have this thing called ADHD that makes it hard to focus. If without kind of that assessment to say, here's why this is happening,
labeling
then
is so important.
sometimes labels are helpful. Sometimes they're unhelpful. Sometimes they're helpful. But like without that, kids can go through and just say, I just don't know. Something's wrong with my brain. I don't know why I can't focus. I don't know why I can't do the things the other kids are doing. And they just walk away from the experience feeling like I'm not as good as these other kids, or that something about me is wrong, something about me is broken. They kind of start taking it more as like a person, like that's who
internalizing,
they,
right?
Yeah, like that. This is who I am. Whereas when you get the assessment to say, this is not who you are, this is actually just a biological issue or whatever issue that has a solution, you are just as good as all these other kids. You just need a little bit more time to do your test. Or you need someone to help you keep track of all the homework assignments so that you don't miss them, because you have the intelligence to do it. You just kind of forgetting to turn your homework in.
Right.
So that way it's not that there's something wrong with me. I just need a little bit of help in some areas.
For me.
Yeah, the system is just not working for me, and I need
Right.
to kind of have these adjustments.
Right, and I feel like if we were working in any other field, when systems don't work, what do? We fix them, we change them.
Yeah.
Sometimes on an individual basis, and some as the whole system needs to change, right? And a big misconception with ADHD, so it's broken down in hyperactivity and inattention, or just combined, you have both. But that inattention label is so misleading, right? It's not that, oh yeah, because my child is space cadet, like they can't focus. It's like, no, they're actually paying attention to so many things at the same time. It's hard for them to focus on just one thing, right? But that label of inattention is scary, because if that student doesn't identify with, no, I can pay attention, which I definitely can, it's just that it's really hard to just pay attention to you right now, right? And so if you're in a classroom and you're trying to hear the teacher, listen to the teacher speak, and there's 7 students around you who are all tapping their pens or stomping their feet or smacking on some gum, then what? Right? The teacher's voice becomes the very last thing you hear. And then it's your fault? No, the system doesn't work for you. So what do? We can give you headphones. We can make them discreet. We can put you in smaller classrooms, so there's not the main distractions. We can make it so that at the end of every Friday, you have 45 minutes with the teacher by yourself, so you can focus with that teacher by yourself. or you can take a period out of your day. Sometimes those end up being extracurriculars. And we do like either push in or push out services where they'll go in the classroom or we'll take you out the classroom, and you will sit with someone who is trained to work with you and your accommodations or your modifications. Say, here, let me help you, and here's how you can help, and here's how I can help. And I can tell you this, like most times at the end, by they reach 12th grade, they leave. They have all of these wonderful newfound strategies they know that that can help them in their life.
Yeah.
And then they're working with all these neurotypical folks who, and at times they can work even better than them, right? Because they're resilient.
Right,
they work
exactly.
so hard.
They know how to they know how to bounce back when things don't work out.
Exactly. They know how to deal with that stress because they just spent X amount of years in the K through 12 system working on that specific thing that some folks don't get to do. Yeah. Some students don't get. And then they also, if the system's working for them, there's an extra level of support. Like I had teachers who helped me, right? Those aren't people you forget, right? So
yeah. Wow. So I wanted to ask about, in your experience, how involved are the parents of Black students? Do they tend to be very involved? Do they tend to be, on average, kind of the same as parents of all races? What do we know about the involvement of Black parents in their child's kind of school experience?
Great question. And honestly, I would say they're at least average or very involved.
Okay.
And I love to see it. And I think in the communities I've worked in, I've worked in Dorchester, I've worked in Quincy, and then this is just for Massachusetts, but I've also worked in Norwell in the South Shore area, and it's very varied, right? And I think as typical it is, parents are busy, and if they are, just because you can't make a parent-teacher conference doesn't mean you're not involved. Everyone is involved in many different ways, whether it be getting or emailing teachers weekly. I've seen so many parents do that. I've heard so many teachers like, hey, so-and-so's mom just emailed me asking for an update on the students' like homework completion of the week, and they talk to other teachers and they get it all down, they've read it down. It's like, and they just ask because they can't just come in at like 5 o'clock on a Friday or a Wednesday or even let alone a half day at 1 o'clock and say, talk to me about my kid. And that just doesn't happen all the time, and that's fine. At least in special education, honestly, I see parents of color being much more involved because they have so many more questions. They have a lot more distrust in the system, validly so. And because of that distrust, they have those questions. But the thing is, it depends who's answering them and how they're answering. Because that answer can do two things. Make that distrust even bigger or settle it down. You mentioned just a couple minutes ago about if you're requesting an evaluation, it's that process is saying, hey, talking to a teacher or talking to the school psychologist or talking to the school special education director or coordinator and saying, hey, I'm really worried about my kid. I want to just request to see if he's eligible for special education. There are letters you can write. And usually that's either the parent requesting it, and if the school sees it, they have something called the student support team. And they will bring up that student if they're seeing that child have any kind of issues in school, whether paying attention or even in social skills. That's a big one we see a lot, especially in the lower grades, is Katie's having a really hard time with Bobby. They're just not talking, and we're seeing it all the time. They're really poor social skills. Every conversation they have with the kid is an argument. Or we're seeing them not be able to cope with not getting a toy at the end of a class. Seeing all those social skills, and then you can get referred to SST, and then data. Data is such a big part of this, and I think some parents don't exactly see all that goes in to a team or a school or a teacher saying, I brought your child up in our SST team. We want to see for special education. Do we have your permission to start testing? Parents just see it as, you're targeting my kid, right? And I can't speak for all schools, right? I'm sure, and I know that there might be some schools where they don't follow that same process, but a lot of schools do it right. And what they do is they see, okay, well, they bring it to the parent, and the parent says yes or no, you can test my kid. But there's been weeks of data going up to that, saying they're checking to see, 5 times out of the 7 days, 5 days out of this, there's 5 school days in a week, not 7. 3 days out of the 5 days in a school week, Bobby had an argument with a classmate, or even in something like reading or even math, Bobby isn't able to identify the 12 letters of the alphabet when all of his students, all of the other peers are identifying 25. Right? And they do testing. They tier 1 services, so things that the entire class gets don't require parent permission. So if there's a little like pop quiz that gets every Wednesday to check to see, those are tier 1 assessments, checking in on the student that way. And all the data gets in the parent is yes or no. And then what happens is, honestly, a parent will be like, why do you think my kid is a problem? And it's like, your kid is not a problem. And the language is also really difficult. Saying, we've identified this, or they may be eligible for special education. Those are big words. Those are scary words. So a lot of my job was like also just saying, hey,
just kind of breaking it down.
And a lot of parents don't have the luxury to have someone to break it down, as unfortunate as that is, because they have to know someone who's in these systems. And that's not very often. I mean, again, it's very rare. 4% of us can tell you how to properly get your student evaluator special education out of the majority. Have fun finding us.
And as you mentioned, kind of like the language is so important. It's something that I think we take for granted. I've seen this happen a lot where in school systems, even I will attend meetings and it's like people are kind of like throwing around lingo and jargon and abbreviations, and it's even I who have meetings with schools all the time, sometimes I'm kind of like, what does that abbreviation mean? What does this mean? and like, and I have some familiarity with the system, and I still have trouble with some of it. And I think sometimes we take for granted that we throw around terms and we don't really slow down to say, I wonder if this parent is actually kind of going into this for the first time, and maybe they don't really understand how special ed works in schools, particularly if they're coming from another country where the school systems there are different, or maybe they're from this country, but maybe they've had other children that never had any needs like this, so they never had to look it up. How do you introduce the idea that your child may need an assessment or may need additional help in a way that invites the parents to feel like you're not, kind of singling their child out or attacking them or, receiving some kind of unfair treatment, right? So this is, I think it is one of the benefits of representation.
Right, it's having someone to be a voice, right? And I think it's so funny because I remember in grad school we were taught write as if a 7th grader is going to read this. And in 7th grade particularly, because if we were to look across the country and say, how many, on average, what is the level of education of our parents, of folks in general, of adults, and usually it's like a mid-high school level. So that's the population you're right for. But that isn't always the case, right? That's just one school out of many in the country. And on top of that, it's really hard with the abbreviations because you don't even know as a parent what to research. You don't know what to look for. You don't know any of those things. You don't know any of the key words, and you shouldn't, right? It required a 3-year education for me, so it shouldn't be as easy as a Google search for anyone. And I mean, I can, when it comes to assessments, are broken down to a couple different categories, right? There's your cognitive, so your brain power. So in meetings, I'll say we did an assessment where we looked at how hard, or not even how hard, it's just like what your child's brain is good at doing. We have different indexes we look at in different assessments. How well they speak, or how well they're able to attain language, how well they're able to utilize their memory, how well they're able to kind of move things around in their head spatial wise, how well we're able to process things, and that's the brain power, right? So we do an assessment on that, and there are multiple different kinds of ones. I'm sure those abbreviations came into play, the name of the tests. Then we have our social emotional assessments, and those are things where we test to see, is your child having difficulty regulating their emotions? Is there an emotion, is there an anxious feeling that's happening more often? Is there an attention? Is it defiance? Is it social skills, like I had said? Are they able to talk to another and be interpersonal? Will they prefer adults versus children or versus peers their age? So many different things. And then there's executive functioning, which is like how they're able to complete their tasks. Schools automatically give planners, right? But using a physical planner may not be what's helpful for your kid. It's not helpful for me, that's for sure. I need to write it down in 7 different places. I got a whiteboard, I have paper everywhere, I have binders, I have notebooks, and honestly, none of them work. If it's not just me memorizing it, then that's it. And we just kind of assume that if I give you a strategy, it's going to work. Not all strategies work. It's a method of what works, what fails. You really have to go through that, but you also have to let students know it's okay to identify strategies that don't work for you. Let's look for ones that do, because they get disheartened very quickly, especially if they see it work for like 10 others and not for them. Right, so there are different kind of categories, and then we get into disability specific assessments, like if we're testing for being on the spectrum, or which is now the autism spectrum disorder it's called, but it's like high function to low functioning, ADHD, a disability, for example, or even then there's also reading, writing, math, all the academic tests. So we do a very large you're trained to do to take from a very large amount of data. So we're not just doing a disservice to your kid by giving them or assigning them a disability and saying, yeah, we're going to base it off this one data point. No, we're basing it off of like 10. From observations in the classroom. We get a questionnaire from them. You fill one out too, and that's a big one. When schools send out parent questionnaires, please fill them out. Please be honest, right? Because that tells us so much. I can't tell you how many times I was going to do an assessment for a student, and I read the parent questionnaire and then changed my mind. And said, oh, I don't need that anymore. You told me everything I need to know. Or this wouldn't actually help, because that's not the issue. You telling me that you moved out of the country and came back at 15 years later, that's helpful to me. Because most likely your kid is not going to tell me, because they just met me. A big part of my job is also building rapport. And I'm not trying to dig up things in their life the first time I see you. Let's play a game. We'll play Uno, baby. I can't learn much from Uno, but you've learned to trust me a little bit, so you can be okay with sitting with me for 3 hours while I make your head hurt.
But again, it makes me think, though, of the fact that sometimes we don't realize that when we ask for assessments, right? So the kid may meet with a psychologist doing the assessment, and the assessment is like the snapshot in time. And the information that you receive from the student may not be completely accurate. And so, that has to be taken into consideration when the results.
Everything should be taken with a grain of salt. And I will say, I've also had students who've come in and have had just a terrible day. A big thing too was I had to be really careful when I took students to test them. I could not. I might as well have just wasted my time. If I take a student right before lunch, I just dug my
but while they're hungry?
Oh my goodness. It changes everything. And a big part is I have to write down my observations while I test a student, because I can get a good scale of where they're at. And sometimes I will write I could have gone through 3 to 5 hours of testing with you, and it was brutal, and I'm so sorry for taking your time, and the student didn't have a good time. They were really just like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. And I've had kids just look at the assessment and say, yeah, that. And I'm like, can you try, please? And I can't prompt more than a couple of times for standardization processes. And I can't just say the next day and start over. Once you've seen it, that's it. Right? So because of that, I can do all of that. And then in my observations, I will say in my report, these results should not be considered as part of students' current functioning. But I will still write an entire report. I have to.
You have to.
I have to. I will write the next 12 pages of of language and observations and analysis of your student, and it will not even apply because your child did not try. But your child not trying is a data point in itself.
Yeah.
Right? I've learned something. We've learned something. But all of that is helpful because I've also done assessments or reports where I just didn't use an assessment. I used just multi methods of data, and I was able to help a child that way.
Wow. So we talked about kind of a lot of things. I wonder if maybe we can talk a bit about explaining the kinds of help. What's a 504? What's an IEP? And is that something that's just Massachusetts? Is that national? Maybe, I'm not sure if they have a phone call.
They hung up.
Oh, they did. Okay. 504 IEP, kind of explaining what those are and how can a parent know that they really, that their child needs one? How do they request that? Right.
So, I mean, this is so hard because with the pandemic, students have been stuck at home with this learning online that is so different than the typical way they've been learning. And while I was practicing, we were in person. So a lot of the things I think about, of course, I'm going to apply as if it is in person. And first I'll answer your first question. So an IEP is an individualized education plan. So that is the entirety or the end product of the special education kind of journey. So like I had mentioned with the SST, the referral system, all of those kind of things, anyone can really refer. A parent, a teacher, even an administrator at a school can refer a student to special education or to the team to then decide if they're eligible. And they go this entire checklist of, again, the ability to, other things that are there actual things that are tangible that are inhibiting them from accessing the curriculum? Is it because they are truant, right? They're not actually attending school the amount of days of the year they're supposed to. And if they are, then your kid isn't eligible for special education because it's not them, right? It's their attendance. Because that they're physically not here to learn, that's why they're not able to learn. Not because something about them is making them not learn. However, if there is a reason underlying that why they're truant, they cannot get out of bed every morning because they have splitting headaches or splitting panic attacks because of their anxiety, because of their depression, because of something else, that in itself can then be said, okay, I'm referring my kid. But in that case, I would say, please don't go to a school psychologist, go to a neuropsychologist, because school psychologists cannot diagnose.
Okay.
We can make recommendations all we want, but I cannot diagnose a child with autism.
So it's important point is that the school psychologist cannot diagnose your child formally.
I cannot.
If you're looking for diagnostic clarity, you need an outside
psychologist, a neuropsychologist, someone who's able to test, who is able to maybe even prescribe medication. I can't do that. I can talk to your kid and help them figure it out.
Can you just diagnose learning problems,
learning disabilities,
reading problems?
And honestly, that more goes towards the learning specialists themselves in schools because they're the ones. Typically, I am trained to do academic assessments. Typically, school psychs aren't. Really don't do them because there's so many other things to do that we have other folks who are trained to give academic assessments, and they're the ones who I'm trying not to use the language. I'm going to say who work with them on the grid, and by the grid, that's an IEP term. Who work with them specifically 30 minutes a week on reading support, for example.
Okay.
So I'm trying to remember the question.
About, basically how the IEP and the 504.
Oh, the 504. So
also.
An IEP is modifications, right? You are modifying the curriculum, right? I am changing something about the curriculum. That's the example I gave earlier. If there's 10 questions on a sheet of paper and that's your exit ticket for the day, I'm going to give you 5 questions instead. That is a modification. So that is something different. An accommodation, however, is I am just making something more accommodating for you, like extra time on an exam. I've extended your deadline, so your homework can be submitted a week late. Those are accommodations, and that's typically what we see. That is what we see on a 504. So a 504 plan is an accommodation plan. 504s are something that can, if you want them to stay with you for the rest of your life. So if you're in high school and you're thinking, hey, I want to be a firefighter. right? Firefighters require exams. And you're like, dang, I can't take an exam right now. I have to take it when I'm 25 and I'm doing all of these things. And I'm going to struggle because I won't have extra time. You can, right? But that's given to you for free in public school, in your school system, in the sense of like, if you're on an IEP and you transition to a 504, which is possible, in Massachusetts at least, they require transition planning, where they say, okay, will your disabilities or will kind of how you are require extra help or assistance after you leave here, right? And then they'll give you a 504 plan, and we'll have a meeting and assessment and all those kind of things the team has to meet. And that plan will be with you, where you can be a firefighter or try to be one, and take an exam and get that extra time, right? Even in nursing school, and even in all these programs, you think about all the tests people have to take, you can get extra time for those things. And that's a 504 plan. Those are accommodations.
So is that probably why, when basically almost any exam that I have that comes up throughout my life, there's always kind of like this little box that says, do you have a disability that needs to be taken into consideration that would affect, like the way the exam day is set up? So like, is it probably asking for whether or not you
most likely
have a right to some special accommodations?
Right.
And sometimes it's things like handicap accessibility and wheelchairs and things like that. But I wonder if that would also fall under that category.
It definitely would. And usually when you have a 504 plan, you tend to have like an advisor or someone working at a disability office, and they will be the one who are usually in contact with the test supervisor or something along those lines, and they will send it to them. You can also very much bring it with you, and they have to legally accommodate you. So there's definitely a difference. And with IEPs, even in the school system, a lot of parents also get really annoyed all the time because they're like, what's taking so long? And it's like, well, you're not the only student, and I'm so sorry, but at the same time, I have so many kids, because there's initial assessments, and then there's reevaluation assessments. Reevaluations happen every 3 years. An initial is, for example, if a student's being referred for the first time ever, we have to do an initial assessment. So that means once a parent signed off saying, hey, I want an assessment for my kid, and we find them eligible after doing all that data process, there's 5 days where the parent at that point, we have to start testing, right? We have to start testing. However, we have 45 school days to get testing done and have the meeting, right?
Oh, okay.
So technically, the minute you sign off that paper saying, hey, I please start testing my kid and they're eligible, I have 45 days from that date, school days, to have a meeting with you about your child and the testing. I have 30 days before all of that in regards to just test.
We do have a phone call? Okay. All right, so we have a call from so go ahead, caller.
So just a quick note that the caller is inaudible, so I'm going to fast forward to the reply. It was a question about providing services to people who speak other languages.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So all of the forms that get sent out have to be sent home in the home family's language.
Okay.
So any kind of legal documentation you get for the school will be sent out in English, of course, because the school has it, but also will be sent out in the home language. And then on top of that, as parents, you are legally allowed to have an interpreter at the meetings as well. Okay. And it's the school responsibility to get that. For you. But again, you have to tell us these things, because if we're unprepared, then it hurts you more than anyone else, right? And I get that it might be scary to say, I need someone to speak Spanish or another language to me because of X, Y, and Z reasons, but really, it's going to help you. We have to be able to do it.
Question in your comments.
Okay, and then there's one more thing I just wanted to say about that was just that if the assessment, if English is not the native language of the person you're assessing, you do have to say that in your assessment report as well.
Oh, absolutely.
There could be some things that are not valid.
Absolutely, and I would even check like the norming of assessment. So like, I'm not going to give an assessment to a student if their population wasn't typically normed in that assessment, because the scores will just be completely off, right? Yeah. It's why if I have an assessment that I give to a 9-year-old, I wouldn't give that assessment to a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, because there's big differences there in norming and scores. So I have to be really careful of all of that, and everything is taken into consideration. But again, it really depends on what you tell me, because if I will write my report, I will base things off of what I assume or what I see, or what I'm given. Most of all, what I'm given. And if I'm not given it, I can report on it and do an analysis with that information.
So we have one final question as we're kind of wrapping up, and it's from Facebook. Thoughts around how schools can pathologize behaviors that are actually normative and involve systems that penalize families.
Wow, big question.
Yeah.
It's a really big question.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know that on the show before we've spoken about how sometimes even a person's personal expression, or maybe they're having a bad day and they're angry or upset, and it gets perceived as aggression or, being disrespectful, and, there's kind of like a tendency to want to like punish rather than kind of say, maybe do you want to talk about this? Are you having a bad day? That kind of thing.
Right. And it's hard because it's definitely a school by school kind of thing, right? If for many folks, when they hear a student be upset with, or, what typically would be considered a defiant behavior or an aggressive behavior, you gotta think about, okay, but then there's this backstory of like this kid is more, there's an idea of this whole child, right? They're more than just their words, they're more than just their actions, they're more than just their thoughts. And you have to, honestly, administrators and teachers have to be trained to think this way. Right, so it's so hard for me to just blame the schools, because I blame the schools that taught these people to do these things, right? And it's again, it's a systems issue. I want to be able to say, I would love to look at a superintendent, and I've spoken to a couple and say, hey, I want you to do this for your kids. And it's kind of like, well, I already am, but it's not working. Because how much can they do? And again, we're all people, but we have to work with the people who teach the schools, which means getting more folks who look like us in these spaces to teach, right? I know briefly, like I work as a teaching faculty in an undergraduate department that's actually a completion program. So all of my students are adult learners. These are all students who've gotten their associates and I now want their bachelor's in psychology and human services. And I get to teach them cross-cultural psychology, which means I'm bringing up my experience of being a Black woman in these spaces. And that's what makes it something they can do and be relatable. When we think about school systems in K through 12, we need specialists. We need teachers who are culturally intelligent, culturally sensitive, who understand that there's a continuum of this. It doesn't just end with reading one book or attending one webinar or one session. And I get that's great work, but continue that, because then you can meet the kids where they're at when they are displaying behaviors that typically we would just punish outright, right? There's a reason for this. No one just comes in a school and starts yelling and screaming, saying like, I don't want to be here. There's a reason for that, right? You take them, you isolate them, right? You never, and of course it depends on the level of aggression. For example, if you're very violent, you don't evacuate the kid, you evacuate the classroom. Right? So there's multiple things you do there, but in regards to just, you work with them. You meet them where they're at. You understand they're a child and this is supposed to be a safe space, so you treat it like a safe space. And you make it clear and you make your intention known that what you want for them is to be okay. And you're going to do what you can, but you have to be honest. You can't say those words if you're not going to mean it, because they definitely will call you out on it and won't trust and treat you that way.
Well, thank you so much. It was really great to have you on the show today.
That's great.
We have to wrap up. And so thank you also for those that have been listening. You've been listening to Black Mental Health Matters. Check me out again next Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on heat981fm.com. So have a great week. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show today. For more on Black mental health, you can go to my website, drkerryann.net. That's drkerryann. You can also follow me on Instagram at drkerryann. And I hope you'll continue listening into my show every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 98.1 FM, The Urban Heat. So keep tuning in.